Welcome to the Anniston Museums and Gardens. I'm Amy Gray, Education Director, and we are celebrating 25 years of the Berman Museum. Our last video explored the early 90s when talks of a museum to carry on the Berman legacy were taking place. Today, in part 3 of our video series, we will look at the first decade and a half of the Berman Museum. When the Berman Museum opened, the first floor galleries, American West and Deadly Beauty, were complete and ready for guests to enjoy. An art exhibit was on display upstairs.
There were 2 galleries that were being installed prior to the opening, and those were the American West and Deadly Beauty.
Okay.
And the American West, you know well. And Deadly Beauty was also on the first floor, and it was subtitled Weapons as Art. So that's where the Royal Persian scimitar was. Ivory handled pistols, those Saxon wheel lock pistols with the ivory inlay, those type of very beautiful weapons.
How long did it take to create the galleries then?
While Southern Customs Exhibits was doing the casework, I was going through Colonel Berman's collection, selecting the items. The sculptures were pretty much an easy thing for the American West. So, move those in. They had pedestals being built and everything like that. The weapons, I was figuring out which weapons fit into the storyline, which, American West from 1800 on, basically. And then I was moving those weapons from Colonel Berman's house to the museum. And myself and a group of really incredible volunteers was cleaning them, researching them, doing all sorts of things with them to get them ready to go in the exhibit. And we were figuring out what was going to go where and all of that. And Deadly Beauty was being worked on simultaneously, but more of the effort was going into American West because it was, the primary exhibition of the 2, I'd say.
Okay. So as far as creating the museum from a staff standpoint, was it, who else worked with you on that portion?
Edward Quick was the director, and myself as a curator. And then we had just a super group of volunteers. Stacy Booth was a graphics artist, and she was working with anything graphical. We had David Kiefer up at Jackson State University. He was my principal designer. Later on, after Southern Customs Exhibits had done the American West and Deadly Beauty, I had Harold Wiles, who was my chief builder. He was very good with construction. He's the one that did all the work upstairs, World War I, World War II, and all of that. Okay. And then I had Herb Griffin, Monica Heffron, Sandy Maynard, Kristen Sparks, Jimmy Striplin, Valencia Nielsen, Rolf Petz, Pat Metters, Ken Newman, Lynn Mercer, Catherine Norris, and a whole bunch of other people.
My goodness.
I mean, the volunteer support was by far the best I've ever seen, along with the community support.
From there, we began the vision of what our upstairs galleries would look like. First, construction began on the World Wars galleries and was completed in 1997. Then, in 2000, at an antique show in Atlanta, former Berman Museum curator Robert Lindley met a wonderful couple that would transform the Berman Museum, Dr. and Mrs. Fu. The Fus began collecting their impressive collection of Asian works of art in the 1980s. Both of the Fus felt the meeting was karma or destiny and decided to donate a portion of their collection to the Berman Museum. As of 2021, the entire Fu family has donated over 1,000 pieces to the Berman Museum. Many pieces of this collection can be seen in the Arts of Asia Gallery.
The Asian collection, of course, Colonel Berman had some Asian artifacts, but when Dr. Fu started bringing his things and blessing us with his largesse, it really really, to me, changed the focus and increased our draw, because the Asian collection upstairs is really by itself something wonderful. And it's been interesting to see local people bequeath their collections of jade, military uniforms, whatever they have that would be within the scope of what we do. And we're glad to see it, glad to have it, and glad to expand past the core of Colonel Berman's collection.
Of course, Dr. Fu offered his items for exhibit over here. He was just such a wonderful man. He and his wife took such an interest in having their collection over at Berman. And I remember one of our Alliance members, who was also a foundation member later, Joel Denny, drove a truck up to Maryland to load a lot of the items after the initial items had come. And he brought back just a truckload of things that Dr. Fu had loaded up.
Wow.
And he just really went out of his way, because everyone had such an interest in seeing Berman grow.
There have been some additions to the museum. Dr. and Mrs. Wade Brannon have contributed, both of them I believe are deceased now, contributed the jade collection, which again is part of that art component. And Dr. Oliver Fu, that's an interesting story. Dr. Fu was a Chinese doctor, and I think he was a PhD doctor, not a medical doctor, I think. Lived, I believe, in the state of Maryland. Now, I don't know the story about how he found this museum, but he's on the other side of the country, and he found this museum, came down and looked at it, was impressed, and said, I want to contribute some of my collection, he said, to the Berman Museum. His collection was Oriental antiquities, some with a great deal of age, and so he brought part of his collection down. Maybe a year later, he brought some more, made about 3 or 4 trips, bringing different portions of his collection, and ultimately he retired and moved to California, called and said, I'd like to bring the balance of my collection.
Over the years, the Berman Museum has developed several creative and innovative fundraising initiatives. Let's hear from 2 people that have helped the Berman Museum flourish.
Well, the first thing I remember doing when I came over here, the girls were really excited about getting a Suds Fest started. They thought that would be the new thing to do around town, and so we began to do that, but we did it on our own. Being financially strapped, we went out and bought the brats, and we made the desserts. We did everything, and actually we cooked over at the other museum and brought the food over here to serve. So that's how it started off in a small way, but it was such a popular thing that we added to and kept growing, and finally it got to the point where it had outgrown us, and so the staff began to have to do more of a part of that. And it was a very popular event, and we made good fundraising money from that. The other thing that we did was Vintage Bazaar, which it started about, I guess, 10 or 12 years ago.
Okay.
And it started, of course, in a small way, because our alliance over here was anywhere between 8 to 15 people. And depending on how many were participating at the time was what we did. And sometimes we had a lot of jobs, and sometimes we were able to call in other people who didn't want to come for a meeting, but they were excited about doing something in a volunteer basis. And they loved Vintage Bazaar. We never had trouble getting anyone interested in working vintage. We had people calling us to see if they could work Vintage Bazaar. And that was a program where we had a split between us and the sellers. We sent out a call for all museum members that were interested in selling their vintage or nice items to come and participate with a split between the museum and the vendor.
I believe around 2004, Berman Alliance, very active group of men and women. We had men on the alliance as well. They did something that was, at the time I didn't think about it, but looking back was very forward thinking. They said, we want to do a beer tasting event. There was a little bit of pushback on that, but we had some ladies, Dr. Karen Hendricks and Lynne Isom and some of those ladies, they said, yeah, let's do that. So the first probably 4 to 5 years, they would set up like almost a family dining. It was more like a German beer tasting kind of thing. They served pretzels and brats, and they cooked it all. You know, they spent all day long cooking brats and that sort of thing. And then they would have about 9 different beers that they would put little cups on a tray. But it was a total seated event. It was very well received. Had about 75 people. They always sold out on the tickets. But at that time, beer tasting was not like it is today. You know, everybody does a beer tasting today, and you know, it's just crazy. So about 5 years in, I was always a part of that group because I was volunteer coordinator. So I would go to their meetings. About 5 years in, they said, we really need you to help us increase our ticket sales. We need to make this event more fun. And so as I got to thinking about it, I thought, okay, so if I want to come to this event, what do I want to see? And I knew that I wanted to see a little more of a party atmosphere. Nothing crazy, but just a little more party atmosphere. So I said, let's get people up on their feet. Let's take them out of the seated whole time. Let's give them some fun music, and let's see how that goes. So that next year we did that. We had the beers. It was all inside that year. We put the bars, and people were moving around. They were enjoying the music and the tasting and everything. Well, after that, I think the word just kind of spread. Hey, this was kind of fun, you know. So the next year, I employed some help from our facilities manager, Scott Williman, and I said, I need you to help me. I said, you know everybody in this town. I'm not from this area. I said, you know everybody in this town. I said, will you help me get restaurants on board to donate food? Because the purpose of fundraising is to raise funds.
Yes.
So we didn't want to keep putting all that money out. So he said, yeah. He said, we'll do that. So we spent months going and meeting restaurant owners and sitting and talking to them and eating their food, and you know, which was fun. Then we went and we met with the beer distributors, and you know, we talked with them and got to know them and everything. And all of a sudden, that year we had all the beer donated and all the food donated.
Wow.
So then we got a little classic rock band that was wonderful, local band, and I said, okay, I would love to sell 250 tickets. We opened up ticket sales, and in 2 weeks we sold 250
And previously you were doing 75.
75.
Wow.
Well, I start to panic because I know I can handle 250 people. Our director's going, keep selling those tickets, keep selling those tickets. I said, no. David Ford was here as business manager, and I said, do not sell another ticket. So it was nerve-wracking, but it was also such a neat experience. We had moved it out front to accommodate. We had put up a tent, and it was just such a nice party. We had older people come in suits. We had younger people, of course, they were over 21, you know, come in shorts and flip-flops, and they just had fun. So the same gentleman, Scott Williman, told me, he said, you can sell over 500 tickets to this event if you'll just open it up. So the next year we brought in the restaurants in-house. They brought servers, they displayed, they decorated their tables up. We filled this museum with food, we set up a 40 by 80 tent.
Wow.
And within a month, we sold over 500 tickets. One of the largest I was ever associated with, and I personally didn't do the actual writing of it, but I participated in it. We collaborated with Calhoun County School System and JSU for a federal grant, and it was called Lastings. And the purpose was really to train teachers more. Many of the history and social studies teachers, you know, they were master's level teachers. But I think the county was looking to give them more resources that they could bring into the classroom so that history would, so to speak, come alive to those students, that it's not just reading a textbook and that sort of thing. So at the museum level, and it was a $500,000 grant. It was a large grant.
Wow.
And Calhoun County Schools, it was awarded to them, and then JSU and museums came on board with that. One of my tasks, and I employed the collections manager at the time of Berman Museum to assist me. We developed history educational resources, the trunks, and they're still here today.
Yes.
We worked on time periods and we put hands-on objects. We looked at their curriculum and we did lesson plans and activities, and I mean, it was a lot of information in each trunk. But the teachers could check them out free of charge for 2 weeks at a time. And they could take these things in the classroom. You know, not all the time could they bring school groups here to Berman Museum. So they could take that, and they were like basically mini museums with lesson plans within them. And so we developed that. We did workshops here at the museum. We did those usually 2 to 3 times a month, and this went on for several months. We hosted lectures. Our JSU history professors came in. They did lectures for the educators. We used our collection a great deal at Berman Museum to explain different concepts or that sort of thing. We also took them on field trips. Within the grant, the museum acquired a 15-passenger van, which I believe is still running today. And so within that grant, because it enabled us to take them to local historical sites as well as regional historical sites.
Wow.
So it was a really neat opportunity to get to know the teachers, the history and social studies teachers. Now these were 9th through 12th teachers. But also it became a very positive situation for us. The teachers used those trunks constantly. Really for a couple of years, it was even hard to get one. They were being checked out so much. They brought their students, you know, for field trips. And that really, you know, it helped us and it increased our attendance.
Along with spectacular fundraisers, the Berman Museum has seen some fun educational programming over the years.
My first association with Berman Fundraising, Dr. and Mrs. McGinnis did a wine tasting fundraiser. And I'm not sure on this, but from the early beginnings of Berman Museum, they did this every year. And it was a beautiful event. It was, you know, white tablecloths and crystal and fine dining, and one of the local, I can't even remember the name of the wine, the gentleman that owned the business, but he would bring in his wine and he would pair it with the food, and then you could taste it. The way the museum made the income was by ticket sales, but also if you bought a case of wine, a certain amount of the proceeds went. So in the last few years that fundraiser was going on, I was able to be a part of that, and that was exciting.
I think one of the things we enjoyed so much doing was Chinese New Year. And during Chinese New Year, we had some of the people from JSU came, some of the teachers. we had one of the Chinese teachers who went and taught the different scripts in Chinese. And we had Jack Hatter, who was so wonderful, and the kids adored him. He came and showed the children how to make a picture using Chinese brush strokes. So even the adults wanted, the kids were elbowing them out of the way to try to have a turn to do that. It was a really exciting program. And we did the origami. And one of the things that we did one year was to have puppetry here at the museum. From Atlanta, they brought a puppet show over, and it was exciting, and the kids got to make their own puppet. So we just tried to do things to integrate the children into the program of the Berman.
Yes, I know oftentimes people may think, oh, it's world history, it's just for adults, when really there's so much here for children.
Yes, and if
of
you
all
start
ages.
them learning about history and doing fun things at the museum, then they're more interested in it. And it's amazing what kids can learn from being here.
Oh yes, and it provides those little like pegs is the way I like to describe it, where they may not remember all the details, but the next time they hear it, they're going to have a point of reference.
That's right.
And so it's just a way to build, you know, add a little more information each time, like you said, starting early. Hopefully instill a love of history, and there's so much to learn, obviously.
Yes. There definitely is for adults too.
Yes.
But we did Camp Camelot on behalf of Berman Museum, and myself and another educator, Angela Morgan, we got together and we wanted, you know, we called it Camp Camelot kind of as a marketing kind of thing, but we focused on doing activities that would kind of reflect each gallery, and we wanted the students, they were 3rd through 5th, to get in the galleries. So we went around town and we got boxes, like refrigerator, washing and dryer boxes, all these different size boxes. And we put them in the room, and we gathered up all sorts of clothing that kids could dress up in and that sort of thing. And of course we developed a lot of different activities and that sort of thing. But when the kids came in, we told them, we said, we want you to develop your castle, your medieval city. And here are all the art activity, you can have paint or markers or whatever, you know. We tried to get some things that the young fellas would enjoy working with, but you know, we had to get some sparkles and stuff like that for the girls. And they just took to that project like it was unreal the very first day, because these are kids, they don't know each other, but we watched them and they started talking to each other after a little while about, oh, well, let's do this and let's do this and let's do this. They also, as the week went on, they would start in the mornings. The first thing they wanted to do was get to work on the castle, but they would start going over and they started choosing costumes and creating costumes. And they worked on that all week. Now, if we ever wanted to do other activities, we could not let them go to the castle first thing in the morning. We had to start with other things, but then they would always get to go back. And at the end, you know, we invited the parents in at the end, and they showed, but the castle was big enough, they could get in it, and they played in it, and they had little, you know, little windows, and, you know, they had made little curtains, and, you know, and we had, but they had learned about the castle and the moat. They had learned about, you know, a lot of things. And my niece and nephew actually came to those camps, and as adults with children of their own, they still talk about that. And it was, I don't know, it's just kind of a sweet memory.
Yes.
But a couple of years ago, a young lady and her fiance showed up, and they wanted to see the Longley. They wanted to get married there. She's a beautiful girl, long blonde hair and everything. And I kept looking at her, and I'm thinking, why do I think I know you, you know? So we went on, and she said, do you know who I am? And I said, I think I do, but I'm not sure. She said, I was the blonde that always had to wear the steeple hat with a veil every morning in Camp Camelot. She said, I remember that. She said, I love that. And she said, I was the little girl that always wore her Sunday best to camp. And I said, and I remember you because I was always scared to death she was going to go home with marker on her white sundress. So to me, that's just kind of full circle. And it's just a neat memory.
Yeah. Growth at the Berman Museum has been a steady trend since our opening. Now let's hear from some great tour experiences.
I think early on, the development of the tours for Berman Museum were a big impact. They had always, from the beginning, there was an educator when Berman Museum opened. And I remember they hosted school tours, but they were just kind of a self-guided tour through the museum. And they did specialty programs, that sort of thing. But I knew as a teacher, we needed to focus on curriculum and it needed to be grade level because you can't, so much of Berman collection, our younger students don't have any background. They don't have a viewpoint. So it may be a cool object, but it doesn't mean anything to them.
Right.
So I knew we had to work to get those at grade level. We had to curriculum focus. Teachers have to reconcile with their administrators that this is why I want to take this field trip. So we started the development of these tours. We developed stations, we called them history stops, and we trained docents as well as staff that would guide the smaller groups. We were able, I guess probably the top amount, we were able to bring in 125 students at a time, and a lot of time they want to bring a full grade level.
Right.
We tried to keep it 3rd grade through 12th grade. Occasionally we did 1st and 2nd graders, but we tried to focus so they would have a little bit of knowledge, of history. So we would bring them in, we would divide them into groups, and the docents, we had developed scripts. We also had stations where they would have hands-on objects in each gallery. So they would take them in, they would go over the topics that would connect with that grade level and hit the curriculum points, and then they would let the students see the hands-on objects that related to that gallery. And then they would get time just to explore, and this became the opportunity for us to teach, sometimes a little bit above their level, but they would be interested in the object, so we would try to teach them, so that maybe in the 4th grade, they say, oh, I remember that.
Right, it gives them that frame of reference.
Yeah, so docents eventually began dressing in period costume, and some of them went into doing a first-person tour, like the Western Pioneer woman. She would come in and she would talk about her Western tour from New York to, Colorado, something like that. And the kids were really taken by that. It was a very win-win situation because parents come with a school tour and they would come in. Of course, their focus is keeping the kids settled and everything, but as they would leave, they would say, we will be back. And so from that tour and that tour development, I think we saw a lot of increased activity just in our general public as well.
I did enjoy giving the tours when I was able and to tell some of the stories about some of the things and some of the artifacts and kind of bring it to life a little bit.
Right.
Yeah.
So what are one of those stories?
Well, let's see, with I do some of the things that Farley would talk about, especially with spy weapons. And there was one sword that had a gun attached to it. And he would just quip about that. Well, if you got into a sword fight with a fellow and he's getting the best of you, then you just shoot him. But he loved, and I had seen him giving some demonstrations. I actually came out to the museum to cover when he would give demonstrations, especially of the spy weapons. And when he had them in the home, he loved to load some of them with blanks. And for example, the flute. He might take the flute out, he'd play a few notes on it, and then he would fire. And then he would often say, "Oh, I didn't know that was loaded," and look up, and you'd look at the ceiling, and there were bullet holes in the ceiling that he had put there, for effect. But he was quite the prankster and enjoyed doing that. And even when you were expecting it, you couldn't help but jump a bit.
Right.
One of the things that I recall is having a private tour of a few folks who came in who were military experts, weapons experts. Two of them had written books on weaponry and that sort of thing.
Wow.
And they were just blown away by this collection.
Wow.
That the quality of it and the extent of it, and for it to be in a small city like Anniston, Alabama, surprised them. And as word gets out, I think it could be a real draw to this area to have the tour buses come through. And there's a tour bus operator who comes through periodically because he happens to know about Berman.
Oh, okay.
And so when he's going from point A to point B, he'll always try to include this and bring his group, especially among senior citizens, because the World War II section was always the most popular section because almost everybody could identify with it.
Right. You were a child when it was going on,
Yes.
or your parents were involved in some way.
Something that I found about in the last few years was that school groups that would come in, some of the children were fascinated by some of the weapons because they're featured in video games.
Yes.
And they would find a weapon here and not realize that it was a real item.
Right.
They
Yes.
thought it was something that was just made up.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Wow, that was a great recall of the beginning of our Berman Museum journey. Join us next week as we continue to explore more Berman Museum history.